Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining me. My name is Mark Thomas, and today we'll be discussing global GRC in the cloud. Now, cloud solutions have been around for some time now, but with the emergence of global and digital transformation, the cloud is a central area to an enterprise's digitization strategy. Now, the cloud can provide great benefits such as cost savings and efficiencies. However, there are some inherent risks that most global organizations don't consider when they choose this route. How can you guarantee information protection when you can't touch the server that your data is stored on? Now, moving this direction does not provide you immunity from some core accountabilities of having the governance and protection of the information being managed in the cloud. And that's what we're going to talk about for the next little bit. So I love to start this discussion off with this cartoon. Look at this guy. This is a security guy. He's focused on his dashboard that's sitting in front of him on his phone. And meanwhile, in the background, he has third parties and suppliers that are exploding, but he doesn't know it. He's only thinking about the cybersecurity, and that's an important piece. But sometimes this can happen with our global governance over using the cloud. So be careful. You need to have a full grasp of all of your risks, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So therefore, some of the objectives we'll hit today is number one, we'll explore the various forms of cloud usage. Very basic. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that one because I really want to spend time on governance. We'll look at some of the core risk scenarios that are inherent with moving your applications and your data to the cloud. And then finally, we'll look at a couple key strategies and some control objectives that I would suggest to help you in your global cloud adoption. So let's just get into it now, get into the agenda. We're going to talk about 4 different areas, but we'll start off, like it or not, the cloud is here to stay. So I want to talk to you a little bit again. We're not going to focus as much on this section as we will some of the concepts of GRC or governance, risk, and compliance, but this is a good starting point for today. So some characteristics of going to the cloud. Of course, you get much, much better access through multiple different types of mediums, elasticity, on-demand service, self-service, of course, measured. You can have multi-tenancy in many of these managed service providers and global cloud providers. And of course, we can leverage resource pooling. Again, pretty basic stuff about why some characteristics of going to the cloud. Now, there are a couple of important service models. Most of us know these already. So there's 3 of them, 3 primary that we see: software as a service. Well, that's basically providing a business application used by many individuals or enterprises concurrently. It provides really the most used cloud applications to nearly everyone online and are accessible from various client devices, such as a web browser or a mobile device. Now, platform as a service, I really like because this is providing application development sandbox, or what I call the stack in the cloud, with the capability to deploy customer-created or acquired applications using programming languages and tools offered by the provider. We see a lot of this being used today in today's more aggressive deployment techniques, such as DevOps. Finally, you have infrastructure as a service. That's online processing or data storage capability. It's a cloud service ideal for enterprises considering very large one-time processing projects or infrequent, extremely large data storage requirements for, say, example, test environments. So if you use the cloud for your global operations, how do you consider governing this? And this is going to be my favorite part because there's going to be a couple things that you're looking at. You may use a public, private, community cloud, or a combination of all 3. But like I said before, oftentimes what we'll find is you may create some risks and vulnerabilities that you did not expect at the expense of the business. So I want you to put together some type of governing model that will help you with this. So let's talk about governance in the cloud. Now, I'm a big fan of GRC frameworks, governance, risk, and compliance. Now, when an enterprise decides to use cloud services for some or all of its services, business processes are impacted, and that makes governance more critical than ever. The following are just a few reasons why enterprises should implement and maintain a governance program. Of course, we're having increasing risk. We have less control over our information and our data because we're using third parties for this. But an important thing here is we need to ensure that we have continuity of critical business processes. That assumes that the cloud is behaving and operating as expected. This helps us communicate from a governance perspective our enterprise objectives. Think about it. One of the reasons why we have a governance system in place is to ensure that we are optimizing our risks, ensure that we're creating value, and ensure that we are utilizing our resources correctly. And this is huge. This helps us satisfy some of the complex and growing external legal and regulatory compliance issues out there. But again, what we're doing is we're expecting that cloud provider or that third party to also be compliant. We can outsource. We can ask somebody to do this for us. But as an enterprise, I am still accountable for ensuring that I am compliant to many of the growing global laws and regulations. And ladies and gentlemen, even considering this current pandemic and all the disruptions that are yet to come, we have to make sure we're looking at this from a risk perspective. So what I want you to do is think about putting a framework together for this. And here's what I really like. Okay, so I want to orient you to this. At the top, you see enterprise governance. We see INT, information and technology governance. And I have a couple of example frameworks that I'm going to focus on for you guys today. Up at the top, enterprise governance is primarily concerned with making sure we balance performance and conformance. A couple things out there we'll use from a performance perspective. We may use the balanced scorecard. Over on the far right, we may use COSO, Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, from a conformance perspective. But what they're trying to do is balance this performance and conformance so that we can create value. Keep that in the back of your mind because that is why your governance structure exists. Now, for a few seconds, I want you to skip this middle layer that I have called INT governance because that's where most organizations fail. And so if you look down at the bottom, I have some example frameworks. Most organizations that I encounter globally, they go from enterprise governance right to picking the frameworks. And that's okay, but every framework is going to tell you, it's going to save your organization. But every framework exists for a specific reason. Here are some reasons why these frameworks exist. You see cyber and information risk. We may have, say, the NIST cybersecurity framework. You could also have, say, ISO 27000 series in there. For cloud services, a couple of them I think are important for you, and we'll see these in a minute. Cloud CSA, we've got NIST and ISO standards. The service management side picks ITIL, of course. Portfolio program management loves the PMBOK. We also have Prince 2 out there and a few others as well. Architecture, we have TOGAF. And so what happens is, if you're trying to create that GRC system and you go out and blindly try to adopt every piece of these frameworks, you may be doing yourself a disservice because you may not have to adopt every part of every one. And if you've ever heard me talk before, you know what's coming up next. And guess what goes right in the middle? One of my favorite frameworks for governance, risk, and compliance, whether we are talking about global cloud operations or whether we're talking about a process called change control. This framework is absolutely huge, and it provides what I call middleware between my enterprise governance and my frameworks. COBIT will help me. It's kind of a framework to manage frameworks. I know that sounds redundant, but it now helps me look at what parts of what other frameworks are out there. But since we're talking specifically global cloud operations, a lot of folks really like to say, well, we have a security framework in place, and let's pick out this thing called the NIST CSF. National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework is currently on version 1.0. So what I like to do is for each one of these areas of your frameworks, you can expand on this. The example I'm going to use for you is this NIST, and NIST says, hey, we have the cybersecurity framework. So the pieces you see under here, you don't have to have a separate cybersecurity framework and a separate governance framework. They all fit into this ecosystem. And that's what I'm trying to show you. I could do the same thing for each one of those frameworks down there. But the idea is this, ladies and gentlemen, have an integrated set of frameworks. And this picture right here is what I want you to remember, because even though it looks very complex, It is showing you how all these frameworks can fit together and be able to provide value for the enterprise. Okay, so I know that's a very busy slide, but I think it's important for us to understand the overall framework and how it fits in. But remember, we said we cannot create value without optimizing our risks. We're operating in the cloud. There is no such thing as zero risk. So we should have some type of risk management strategy or methodology. This also fits within the framework that I showed you a few minutes ago. Few standards out there to help you with this: ISO 31000, NIST risk management framework, multiple places that you can turn to for this. But in general, what we want to do is identify what our risks are from moving to the cloud, or if we're in the cloud, what are those emerging risks? So the cycle is to continuously identify our risks, analyze and assess those, respond to those risks. Remember, we may not mitigate everyone. We may choose to accept or avoid some of those, or even transfer. Monitor those risks through a set of key risk indicators, and finally, maintain our overall risk profile. But how do we now apply that to going global on the cloud? It all comes down, folks, to managing and understanding your third-party risks, and that's important here. So what I have in the bottom here is when you're looking at outsourcing or using cloud services, there's basically three core steps. You're going to select the provider and contract with that provider. You're going to operate and maybe even change within the performance or the service level agreements. And at some point, you may determine to transition out. Folks, one of the biggest areas of risk for you in this third-party life cycle is when you select and contract. Being a former managed service provider in which I did provide cloud services, I would provide you your private cloud. If it was not in the contract, I was not going to do it for you. Okay, we'll talk about some of those things here, and I'll give you some insights in just a second. But what are some of those key risks now that we might have? This is pretty big. So these are some things to consider. Of course, you've got data location and ownership, right? Regardless of the deployment style that you use, you may not have the physical location of that server to process and store your applications. I've got cloud computing technologies that allows cloud services or cloud servers to reside everywhere. So location is largely irrelevant for you, but it's important to understand that many cloud service providers can also specifically define where data can be located, down to the server level and the country level. That can be done, but there's a sliding scale. Some organizations, you're not going to have a whole lot of negotiations with. Those are usually your larger organizations. But if I move down to more of a boutique type of provider, I may have a few more negotiation points with them. Of course, cloud data ownership, we talked about that. Make sure that your contract states, right, that you own that data. And that's a pretty significant thing. Of course, we have things like having the commingled data. Again, we've really fixed a lot of that with using appropriate meta tags affixed to your client information so that commingled data can be separate. But again, it's a risk. You need to understand my security policy and make sure I'm being transparent, right? Some CSPs have less transparency than others. There's that sliding scale. So have an understanding of that in your contract and even with your service level agreements with me. This is a big one, APIs. As with back in the 1970s with proprietary software from vendors, many cloud service providers currently implement their applications using proprietary APIs. And if you call me and say you're leaving, your data I can give you, but it may not work because I am not going to give you my proprietary APIs with it. A big one for you. Of course, the viability of the provider, right? We have new organizations that are going out of business or being purchased by other organizations. Making sure that I keep information from a forensic standpoint, just in case there is some type of forensic audit. And of course, a couple other big ones that will be done with this soon, but are identity and access management. Right? I need to have adequate user access privilege controls. even with more sophisticated applications going online, available for access by enterprise users, partners, and clients, right? We need to have a least privilege based user access environment. Of course, penetration detection, screening of other cloud computing clients. Now, I may not let you know who my other clients are, but if you don't ask, you'll never know. But how do you ensure that I'm compliant? Right. So one of the things we said is we have this growing complexity of global compliance, right? Including things like privacy, PII, payment card industry requirements, various financial reporting laws, right? Cloud computing services can challenge various compliance audit requirements currently in place. So things like location and those kinds of things. One of the things we'll talk about later is, hey, if you can you get a right to audit me? Most of them will say no. Microsoft, Amazon are not going to let you audit them. That move down the sliding scale if that's an absolute requirement. But I should be able to provide you some type of statement of compliance done by a reputable accounting or auditing firm that shows that we are compliant to those areas. Think about it, guys. And when I was a managed service provider, I had over 400 clients. I hosted over 400 companies. Every one of those 400 companies had their own set of unique requirements globally. Okay, of course, we need to do our due diligence, and we did talk about business continuity, disaster recovery. What are our plans around that? I was using a cloud service provider back a few years ago that had a complete power outage, and my services went dark. And I got a letter from this cloud provider that said, sorry about that, right? My continuity, my business was at risk. And all I got was a letter that said, sorry. Okay, so now we've kind of taken a look at all kind of some of the key risks you might want to have there. You should identify your responses based on some of these risks and the risk scenarios that you build out of that. So therefore, you may accept it, transfer it, avoid it, or even mitigate it. But if you choose to mitigate, you should have a set of meaningful controls in place. And what you see here, I'm not going to jump into all these control objectives, but I do want you to recognize that I have two types of control objectives here for you today. What you're looking at are the governance control objectives. I'm not going to read these for you, but I do want to point out that I did pull this out of an IT audit and assurance program for cloud computing by ISACA, and I'll show you some other things that I want you to look at in a bit. So break up your controls into governance controls that you're looking at here. Each one of these in this document, by the way, goes into specific activities, specific testing procedures for you. You see some of those we've already talked about. We've talked about information risk management, third party, legal and electronic discovery, and of course, right to audit, auditability, and so on. So those would be my suggested governance control objectives. Let's move on to the next slide called operations objectives. Same thing. This came out of the IT audit and assurance program for cloud computing by ISACA. And each one of these control objectives, if you get the document, you don't have to, but I'll show you some other places to look. It gives me 10 key control objectives. And I can tell you guys without hesitation, every risk scenario I thought about or I had as a cloud or managed service provider, these control objectives I've just shown you will help you become more secure and more compliant. So this is just one area here, but I also want to give you a couple of other references that I think are important for you. Here are my top references. If I were you, here's where I'd go look. Number one, again, you know I love COBIT, but I will tell you the COBIT framework, COBIT 2019, the latest release by ISACA. This started off years ago as an audit and security type of framework, and today has grown into truly what I believe is one of the only governance of enterprise IT frameworks that exist. And this document I'm showing you here is what's called the governance and management objectives that will give you everything you need to know about your processes. Next, we have the audit and assurance program, cloud computing. This is the document I pulled those control objectives out of. And this is a key one for you to take a look at too. Of course, since we're talking cybersecurity related activities, you could go down the ISO path, which I do not have any of those examples here. One of my personal favorites is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 1.1. You can get that on nist.gov. Last one we have is basically from the Cloud Security Alliance. This is a neat one. The security guidance right now it's on 4.0. Great place to go find some of the good information. Of course, how do we have cybersecurity without the CIS controls? We used to call this the top security controls. You can get this at cissecurity.org. Some of my favorite places to look for you. So finish up. I've got a couple tips for you that I think are good parting information for you. Number one, hey, I don't care if you're talking global cloud or if you're talking process. Have an organization-wide GRC framework. And you saw, I said, and I suggested COBIT be at the center of that. Next, make sure that you're looking at those risk scenarios and you're connecting those to your third-party management strategy. Third party, also including your cloud providers. Use some of those industry suggested controls that I just showed you from those 4 documents that I would turn to if I were you. And finally, there's a big one. Make sure you know which services are affected by using a cloud service provider, because remember, as an IT organization, I exist to provide services for the enterprise. And if I go get a new technology or a new service that's going to underpin the service that I'm providing for my organization, I have failed as a service provider. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that was a lot of information for you in a very short amount of time. Thanks for joining me today. I hope the information I shared was valuable and helpful for you. Feel free to keep in touch with me via my email or social media platforms. Have a great day. Have a great conference. I was glad I could share part of your day with you.